And now, without further delay, let's get to tonight's presentation. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Aileen Friesen in the past, so I'm delighted to have her with us here tonight. Aileen Friesen is an associate professor in the history department and co-director for the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. She is also the executive director of the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation. Her research focuses on the experience of Mennonites in Russia, and she is the author of two books, The Russian Mennonite Story, along with Paul Taves, and Colonizing Russia's Promised Land, Orthodoxy and Community on the Siberian Steppe. She is also the editor of the Plett Foundation's journal, Preservings, which many people might be familiar with. It's a publication that comes out twice a year and explores themes relating to the history of Mennonites who came to North America from Imperial Russia in the 1870s, their descendant communities, and their ancestors. Aileen, thanks for being with us here tonight. We're looking forward to hearing from you, so I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Andrea, for that introduction, and thank you to Mennonite Heritage Village for the opportunity to speak with everyone tonight. I will say that I'm looking forward to the time when we can all meet in person, because talking to a screen can be rather lonely for the presenter, but we'll do our best tonight. And before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine, the Cree, the Dene, and Dakota peoples, and the heartland of the Métis Nation. Treaties signed with Indigenous peoples, like Treaty 1, made all of Mennonite migrations possible to Canada. So we should acknowledge them as we speak about migration here tonight. So when Andrea first approached me about doing a presentation, I originally thought back to a memory I had of living in Champaign-Urbana while I was a postdoctoral fellow at the university there. And I attended a Mennonite church in town. And while I was living there, a new gun law was passed, allowing for concealed weapons to be carried. And I started to see signs on buses and at the university, like a no smoking sign, but with a gun in the middle and a line through them to indicate that concealed weapons weren't allowed in this space. And the church I was attending decided to have a conversation about whether or not a similar sign should be posted at the church. And someone at the meeting made the statement, well, everyone knows that Mennonites are pacifists. And of course, as a historian, my mind right away thought, well, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And as Andrea's description of the display and exhibit at MHV demonstrates, there are complications to our understanding of what it means to be pacifist, what it means to be non-resistant. And today I'm going to explore some of those issues. And I wanted to talk about migration, particularly from the 1870s migration from the Russian Empire, for a number of different reasons. And some of you might be thinking, well, haven't we done this topic enough? So just to remind some of you, to situate you, I'm talking about in the 1870s when the Russian state introduced conscription, and approximately a third of the Mennonite population, 18,000 people, left the Russian Empire for new homes in North America. And yes, we have explored this question quite diligently in the historical literature, but I wanted to do the presentation on it because on the one hand, we are coming up to a lot of anniversaries. So around the corner is the anniversary of the 1922 Mennonite migration to Mexico. Then we have the 1923 Russlander centenary, and then we have the 150th anniversary of the coming of these 1870 Mennonites to Canada. And I hear a lot when I'm talking to members of our community about how people remember these migrations. And so I think it's always good to refresh our memory as we're coming up to these anniversaries about what was the actual situation that happened. I also wanted to talk through this particular issue because I, at our Mennonite Heritage Archives, found some new sources, and these sources related to the Russian state. So they were produced by the Russian state. And anyone who has read the literature on the 1870s migration knows that there's a lot written, but it is almost exclusively from the Mennonite perspective, or it's Mennonites reflecting on what they believe the Russians are doing. And so these types of sources give us a new insight into the other side of this migration, and how the Russian state understood and viewed Mennonites, and how this migration developed according to the Russian state. Now, to start the story, let's just think back of how Mennonites will enter the Russian Empire in the late 18th and early 19th century. And of course, as many of us know, they had a privilegium, a set of privileges that were given to them first through their negotiations with Catherine II's representatives, and then Paul will sort of solidify them, and they will be then reconfirmed by Alexander I, by Nicholas I as well. And in this, which is primarily an economic document, there is the privilege of not having to serve in the military. Now, of course, it wasn't just Mennonites who had this privilege. It was also other colonists who were coming during the same time, and they are also given this right of not having to serve in the military. This will, as we know, come to an end. Russia will start to enact a variety of reforms, most significantly the emancipation, or the freeing of the serfs, that people who didn't have rights to property, who didn't have their own sort of legal structures, they will be free to do more of what they please. And this will also include legal, judicial, governance, and other types of reforms that the Russian state will undertake in order to modernize the empire and to streamline and standardize the administration. And military reform will be one of the key components of this, and the introduction of conscription. So Mennonites will find out about the introduction of conscription quite early. The Russian state will release sort of a proposal to get people used to the idea, and Mennonites will be informed of this quickly. Some will say that it will come from newspapers, so it will be released to the Russian newspapers. Others say that Mennonite connections within the government meant that they were informed directly about what was taking place. And of course, they're worried initially. They are thinking, well, we have this charter of privileges. How come this is not going to continue on? And they will start to talk this through. In case they thought that maybe this wasn't going to be the case, the initial proposal for military reforms is also being translated into German and published in German newspapers, so they can read all about it. And this description is very interesting of what the Russian state is proposing. And of course, they're presenting it as they have military weakness, they can't compete with other European states, and the armies are being formed in Europe. And they think that universal conscription will be a key way to address this specific situation. And they're also introducing sort of basic concepts of citizenship into this discussion. So the idea that it is the duty of Russian citizens, the sacred duty to defend their fatherland or motherland. And there is this sense that this will be applied across the board universally. And this impacts not only Mennonites, obviously this impacts the Russian nobility, it impacts all sorts of segments of society that previously did not have to serve in this capacity. So the Russian state makes the announcement, but in fact, they hadn't really come up with what they were going to do. They sort of let people know that it is going to take place, but they haven't actually put together the regulations. And they will have two commissions that will start up right away that will go into more detail. The first commission will address the organization of the military, and the second commission will deal with the terms of service. So what is actually expected of people within Russia? How long do people have to serve? What's the way and mechanism by which conscription would be enacted? It's important to understand that from the outset, Russia understood, so the Russian officials that are undertaking these reforms understood that they were dealing with a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, very complex empire. There was although they said publicly many times that they wanted this to be universal, there was some give to what was going to be expected of people. It was generally understood that there were going to have to be some exceptions made, although they wanted to limit the exceptions as much as they possibly could. And some of these exceptions would also have to be made for issues of economics, for issues of the economy. So it wasn't just on the basis of there were already educational restrictions put in place. Obviously, Russian Orthodox clergy weren't expected to serve, and there are other ways in which they were going to accommodate. Of course, when Mennonites first hear about this, they organize together and send delegations from the various colonies to try to get a sense of the lay of the land. And there will be numerous delegations over the years that are trying to engage the Russian state in a discussion about what will actually be expected from Mennonites. And that is the Mennonite story that is traditionally told of all these delegations that appear, the petitions that appear, the meetings that they take with various Tsarist officials. But if we look from the point of view of the Tsarist bureaucracy, so what do they record about this? We have all of our sources that record exactly where these meetings take place and what was discussed. But what does the Tsarist bureaucracy have to say about what took place? Well, interestingly enough, for them, the story starts with a meeting that we don't record. It is a meeting that they claim took place in the fall of 1871. So early on when the commission was still underway. And it's claimed that Mennonites from Taurida province went to Crimea and petitioned the Tsarina, so the wife of the Tsar, and that they went to the palace there where the Tsar and the Tsarina typically vacationed, and that they fell to their feet before Her Majesty, and they requested that they be exempted from military service. And the documents within the Tsarist bureaucracy claim that she read the request and that she gave it to her personal secretary and asked him to look into this further. Her personal secretary then made a request from the Governor General of New Russia and Bessarabia, who is named General Adjunct Pavel Kotzebue. And he then provided his own interpretation of the Mennonites, which was very interesting to read. And his interpretation was then passed up the bureaucratic chain as people were trying to figure out what to do about these Mennonites. So Kotzebue is a very interesting figure in that he was like I said, the Governor General of New Russia. He had a history with Mennonites. He was in charge during the struggle between Mennonite brethren and the larger church. And so he had already knew who Mennonites were, had a good sense of their theology, and he then gives his interpretation to the Tsarist state. And he claimed that he told the Tsarina's secretary that conscription directly contradicted the system of beliefs of Mennonites. And he claimed that he had tried to convince Mennonites that they would have to care for wounded soldiers or they would have to do something, but he got pushback from Mennonites, and they claimed that they did not want to do any direct or indirect service, that this would be against their faith, and that they would move if necessary, no matter what the sacrifice. And he also reiterated to the Tsarist Empire that Mennonites had already left. They had done this before, and that is how they came into the Russian Empire, is that they were leaving their former homeland for the same issue, and that if the state didn't want to lose such hardworking people, that they should then think through what kind of concessions could be made. He also emphasized the economic contribution to the region of the Mennonites and put forward the argument that there would be real damage, economic damage done if they left. He finally said that they never concealed faith. They never concealed their faith. And so this wasn't something new. This was something that could be expected. And he didn't think that it would really harm the Russian military very much if some sort of accommodation could be made. Now, it is Kotzebue's interpretation of who the Mennonites are that will rise within the Russian bureaucracy. So it's his interpretation, his reports that he makes about the Mennonites that will end up in front of the commission that is deciding terms of service. And this issue was made a little bit more poignant for the commission because there were already reports about Mennonites selling their land and getting ready to leave. And so they went and considered this issue, and as many of us know, came up with a compromise, what they thought was a benevolent compromise. The Mennonites won't interpret it that way, but what they thought at the time was quite a good compromise. And that would be to assign Mennonites to non-combat positions within hospitals, and that they would be free from carrying weapons, and that, but that this would just be for Mennonites who had already come into the empire. And so this was printed and became part of the commission, a statute of the commission. Now, Mennonites' response to this, so this commission, this statute comes out in 1874, the beginning of 1874, and Mennonite response to this is not to calm down at all, as the Tsarist regime assumed that they would. Instead, things pick up. And so there had been lots of agitation for migration from different groups, but the Hortitsa Church had been pretty stable throughout this period, and they had decided to wait until they saw the statute before they made any decision. And once they saw this statute that I just read to you, they decided that they now needed to send a delegation to America that summer and to start really exploring seriously this possibility of emigrating. And of course, the year before in 1873, there had been a delegation that had gone to North America and had scouted out land and had sort of met with governments and had a exit strategy for leaving the Russian Empire. But Hortitsa colony hadn't really been interested in this. And one of the reasons why people could do this, why they could theoretically leave the Russian Empire, was because of a new law that had been instated on June 4th, 1871. And on that day, the Russian state got rid of the category colonist. So all of these Germans had come into the Russian Empire as colonists. Other groups had come into the Russian Empire as colonists as well. And colonists had all been exempted from military service and had a variety of different privileges attached to that position. The Russian state got rid of that category, and now everyone was going to be under a new category, village owners, and this was also going to standardize kind of the imperial system on the ground in rural spaces. And so this brought in new administrative structures. So this would be incorporating these villages that were outside of the structure not of the Russian state, they're within the Russian state, but they kind of had their own system. This would now be incorporating them into just the normal bureaucratic structure. And since this was a significant reform, the Tsarist state also put in a clause saying that people could renounce Russian citizenship. They had 10 years from the date in which this was enacted to then leave the Russian Empire. And if they wanted to leave, then they could get passports and they could start to go. So Mennonites right away, who are worried and concerned about military service, now have a way and a path of getting out. And that is through asking for passports and leaving the Russian Empire. And of course, on these passports, it was claimed you are renouncing Russian citizenship. So you're leaving forever. But many people did not worry about that clause. Interestingly enough, some people within the Russian state thought that Mennonites were gaming the system, so that Mennonites were using this specific legislation as a way in which to sell their lands and get out at a profit to themselves, and that this actually wasn't about military service. That is not why they were leaving. As there are a number of problems with this interpretation put forward by the Russian state, but it appears in the document. So it's interesting to see that the Russian state is also questioning whether or not this is actually about military service or if this is about something else. As things are picking up, the decision is made, and some say it came from the Tsar, and most likely it did come from the Tsar, to send in a representative to sort of calm the waters with the Mennonites. So Edward Tatlebin, also a Baltic German who was part of sort of the military structure, had experience within the Russian military, was sent there to talk to Mennonites and to see if he couldn't find a solution. And in the documents I've been exploring, there is his report that he submits right after he goes to the Mennonite colonies and has discussions with them. So this gives us a pretty good idea of how Tatlebin interprets the situation with Mennonites, and also what kind of information is then being passed along within the Russian bureaucracy, and based off of that information, people are going to make decisions. So Tatlebin travels to Helmstadt, and he goes there with the Taurida governor. And at first, he doesn't just meet with Mennonites. He meets with a select few. He doesn't say whether these are Mennonites or not Mennonites. He doesn't make that distinction. But you have the feeling that quite possibly there were some Mennonites in there who are giving him some insider information about what's going on in the colony. So these select few tell him the following. They tell him that Mennonites can be divided into three groups. The first group are the people who have sold their land and who are going to America, and that they have been seduced by, quote, fanatics within their own group, including the delegation that went to the United States, and also by foreign agitators. And these are people who are convinced that they cannot serve in the military at all, either directly or indirectly, and they are kind of out the door. The second group, which was the largest, was then divided into two categories. One category, according to these insiders, were people who wanted to stay in Russia, but who didn't feel comfortable saying it. They didn't want to come out on the side of staying, but they actually deep down wanted to stay. The other group were people who wanted to leave and who believed this was the only way to preserve their faith, would be to go. And then the third group of this trio was a very small number of people, but interestingly enough, these were people who wanted to agitate for others to leave so that they could then take the land at an advantage. So these are the three groups that were presented to Tatlebin. So Tatlebin goes and brings everyone together. He explains the situation. He doesn't want them to rush. He, butters them up, saying that he appreciates everything that they've done. He then also tries to scare them, saying, if you're going to lose out on all of your material well-being, that you're going to go to America and the same thing's going to happen to you there. And he tries to persuade them in these various ways to stay. And of course, Mennonites, and to stay and to accept the original statute that had been put forward by the Tsarist regime. So Mennonites, of course, are very polite and express their gratitude, but then they quote scripture and say they cannot possibly serve within the military, even in non-combat roles, that they would rather be doing things within their own colonies, and that they just couldn't be associated with the military. So Tatlebin takes a step forward and says, okay, well, maybe we can do something about that military part, and puts forward the idea that they could serve under the Ministry of State Property, with Forestry Service, or that they could do some other civilian type work, in which case they wouldn't have to be under military supervision and wouldn't have to carry weapons. And so then he sends them back to their various congregations to explain this to them, to other Mennonites, and then to hopefully have a discussion about them. So he talks to the Helmstadt deputies first, and initially they couldn't come to an agreement, according to Tatlebin, and they tried to negotiate with them more. And then he decides to put his foot down and say, no, negotiations are done. I'm actually not here to negotiate. I'm here just to tell you what the Tsar was wanting to give to you. And that is all I can do. I can't do anything else. And so they thank him for that, and then start adding in more conditions of what they would like to see. So they want to see their own type of service. They don't want the state to decide what that type of service will be. They wanted permission to leave if the situation changed. In the future, they wanted to have management over their own schools, and they promised that they would emphasize Russian language within their schools, but they wanted to be in control of them. And they also wanted to make sure that they had proper supervision over the young men that would be serving in these various capacities, so that they could maintain church discipline. There was also a sort of a clause about not wanting to allow the future generations to make decisions for themselves, so that they're saying, right now we're willing to do this, but maybe our next generation will have a different interpretation of what this means, and maybe they will want something different. So Tatlebin will end up forwarding these requests onto the Tsar, but sort of implies that maybe this will be okay, that different concessions can be perhaps made just a little bit. So then he ends up going to the other groups, including ones that we know will leave. So Alexanderville, the village of Alexanderville, he goes there, and when he gets there, they are praying in the church, and he tries to explain everything to them, and they are just asked for their passports. They are done with this system, and they say that they can't serve in these capacities and maintain their faith. Then he goes to visit the Kleine Gemeinde, and this petition given by the Kleine Gemeinde has been reproduced by Delbert Plett, who emphasized, I think, a very good point that maybe gets overlooked in the literature, in that the Kleine Gemeinde presented to Tatlebin a more expansive understanding of non-resistance. So in their petition, it's not just about military service. It is also about the changes to the laws enacted by June 4th, 1871, in which they are now having to serve in administrative positions within this new administrative structure. And they feel like they can do that and keep their faith. And so this is a much more expansive understanding of non-resistance than being presented by the other congregations. And they also, each one of these petitions, is very flowery and is complimentary to the Tsar. And the Kleine Gemeinde promise that the future generations, their children will remember the good times in Russia, and that they have nothing but fond memories, but they would actually now like to leave. Then he will head to Hortitza, where he will kind of have the same conversation he had in Helpstadt. He'll travel around a little bit, and ultimately the deputies in Hortitza will sign the same document as the ones in Helpstadt. So he describes all of these interactions with Mennonites, and then he does a very interesting thing. He starts to describe the colonies, and it's clear that he is making a case for benevolence to the Mennonites. Probably he knows that people are getting a little bit tired of Mennonites and this constant petitioning, and that people aren't really maybe appreciating the Mennonites and their contribution. So he describes them in very flowery terms. The colonies, he says, are flourishing. He likes their straight streets and their orderliness and their cleanliness. And he claims that there are portraits of the Tsar and members of other royal families in the houses of Mennonites. And he compliments them on their agricultural implements and the factories and how they treat other people, and how well their records are kept, and how they're kept in Russian by clerks who do just a superb job, who have mastered the language, that everything is translated swiftly and accurately. And he also compliments their education system and says that it's not entirely their fault that they don't know Russian, that part of the problem is that Mennonites can't attract native Russian speakers as teachers because it is, quote, difficult for them to get used to the strict living conditions of the Mennonites, unquote. So he is complimentary, and then also kind of, brushes off maybe some of the other concerns that other people have raised. And he also, at the end of this document, he confesses that he has to, the Mennonites came with 4 more demands, and he isn't allowed to, he doesn't have permission from the Tsar to give these demands, but he wants the Ministry of Internal Affairs to pass them along. And he claims he didn't really have a choice in the matter, because he needed to put something to rest, and Mennonites wouldn't do it unless he would pass along these requests. So he then also emphasizes that they should get on with these regulations, and with the reconsideration of these regulations, so that Mennonites know where they stand. This report then moves up the Russian bureaucratic chain to the Minister of War, Dmitry Milutin, who then has a response to what he has been told. And I think Milutin's response is very telling for how we can see people on the ground, people who know Mennonites, who relate to Mennonites, they will champion the cause, but from above, the situation doesn't look necessarily the greatest. So he right away makes the claim that this is not about military service, that this is about something completely different. He says that Mennonite separateness will come to an end, and that is what is taking place now, is that people are realizing, Mennonites are realizing that it will come to an end, and that they have to merge with the local population, and they don't like it, and that is why they are leaving. And he also expresses his displeasure that these negotiations have been going on for 3 years now, and he believes that every time Mennonites come with more demands than what they had originally asked for. And he doesn't want the article that has already been put into law to be changed. So this exemption that has already been put into place by the Russian state at the beginning of 1874, he just does not want to change it. He thinks that any more concessions to the Mennonites would be an affront to the dignity of the Russian state. So he is very much against that. Ultimately, Miliutin will be, while his concerns will be taken into consideration, there will be some leeway for negotiations in certain elements of what Mennonites asked for, and that will go through to the top of the state system, to the state council, who will then allow some of this to move forward, not about the schools, but about, as we know, Mennonites having spiritual control over their young people, who are then going to be primarily in forestry service, although that wasn't necessarily specified as the only way in which Mennonites would serve, even though Mennonites wanted that to take place. So ultimately, an amendment will happen, and the ones who felt like that was the only thing that was keeping them from agreeing to stay in Russia will stay, and others will leave. So my title starts with myths, and some of you might be thinking, where are all the myths in this? Where are we going to get to this? And I think one of the myths that I seem to keep encountering is this idea of betrayal. As you can see through the description that I have given, there is really very little sense that the privilegium will never change on the part of Mennonites. I think initially they were a little bit shocked that this was happening, but after they get over that initial shock, they are very reconciled to this idea that you can't make that claim, that you make the claim for exemption based off of your faith. And that is what is at stake, is faith. It's not about a document, privileges. That is not the essence of what's happening. And that what they need to do is to show that their faith doesn't allow them to undertake military service, and that hopefully that someone will listen to them. And the petitions of people who are leaving are very complimentary to the Russian state. Now, obviously, we can say it's because they want their passports, but there is this sense of, okay, we lived here, we experienced this, and now we are ready to move on. I think another myth that tends to be assigned to this 1870s migration is this idea that there is one interpretation of non-resistance, so only one way to be faithful to that. And the Kleine Gemeinde example shows us that there can be more expansive definitions that particular groups have. The ones who remained in Russia also said that they were living by their faith. The ones who left said that they were living by their faith. The ones who remained said they're living by their faith. And then there have their differences of opinion about what that actually means. Does non-resistance mean not serving in the military, not serving in any form that is kind of construed as conscription? Is it participating in civil office? What is the definition of non-resistance? And there are different ways in which each group sees this. And the way they see this is not unchanging. So, for example, if we take the Kleine Gemeinde again, during the Crimean War, which took place before all of these military changes, the Kleine Gemeinde, the Burgdaler Mennonites helped out the Russian military. The military came through, they quartered troops stayed in their homes, they fed them, they set up hospitals. Mennonite women were also involved in treating the wounded from this war that's taking place in Crimea. And they dispensed medical service. And this worked both for and against them during these negotiations with the Tsarist Empire. Many people, Tatlebin, other people said, these Mennonites are actually really good. They helped us during the Crimean War. They didn't ask for any money. They paid for it all. They gave service to the state. But then it also worked against them in that Miliutin said, well, if they did this, how come they can't continue to do it as a form of non-combat conscription? But if going back to the point about the Kleine Gemeinde, so the Kleine Gemeinde participated in all of these things. And then later on, under Altister Peter Taves, he will regret that they did this. So he will say, yes, we did it, but we didn't mean to, or that this was an abrogation, this was against our faith. So they have to backtrack a little bit on that issue, which shows that even within communities, these things change. And it's notable that after the negotiations for military exemption or for alternative service that Mennonites are engaged in, there will be another war. There will be the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78. And in that case, once again, Hortitza and Helpstadt will join together, treat wounded soldiers, give money. So they will do many of the exact same things that they had done during the Crimean War, even after these new privileges had been put into place. And finally, I think a myth that we need to take into consideration is that Mennonites are not receiving concessions because they're great negotiators. They are good at finding patrons, so people who are willing to speak on their behalf. But from the documentation circulating within the Russian state system, Mennonite voices are actually quite absent. And what gets repeated are these patrons who are willing to talk about Mennonites and to present Mennonites within the system. But even those patrons also have a different view of what the end goal is. So for Tatlebin, for instance, he very much thought that this was a way to assimilate Mennonites, that this was a way to bring Mennonites into the system. This was a way to get young people to see new things and to be accustomed to new customs and concepts that they weren't experiencing within their colonies, and that this would be the way in which that they would then be brought into the Russian Empire. And finally, one of the myths that we also haven't explored is return migration. So it didn't happen often, but it did happen that sometimes Mennonites would return to Russia, and that is another topic that needs to be explored. But I'll conclude with that today, and I'm very excited to hear your questions.
Very much, Aileen. So we're going to open it up for questions. Again, if you have questions for Aileen, we'd welcome them. Write them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. I know people have said hi in the chat so far, but that's where your questions should go. So we'll just see if anybody's going to catch up. But I guess, Aileen, while we're waiting for some people to write some questions in the chat, I have one for you here. So this idea of mythologies, probably some people are kind of surprised to hear that word used in relation to history. We think of history as facts, and isn't there like a right and a wrong way of looking at these things? Can you talk a little bit more about mythologies? How and why are they created? Are they helpful in some way? Are there dangers or pitfalls with thinking about history in terms of these kind of bigger mythologies that we build for ourselves as a community?
Yeah, they are very good at building identity. So in that sense, it's not surprising that communities come up with their own myths about themselves and why they do things. And so on the one hand, they have their place, but there is also a way in which they can be disruptive. And I'm thinking particularly now, this division between different migrations is still very strong within the community of how people define themselves and define their experiences. And not always this, a lot of times it's what they think about themselves and their history is being created as a counterpoint to someone else's experience in a different migratory group. And it'd be nice just to sort of start to see the commonalities that we have, and then also to start to just appreciate our stories for what they are. The 1870s story is incredibly interesting, and it doesn't need to be in competition with the 1920s story. And the 1920s story doesn't need to be in competition with the 1940s story. I mean, each story has its own merit and its own soul and its own dynamic. And so hopefully we can, as we approach all of these centenaries, can sort of try to move away from that comparativeness and get into seeing what the commonalities are, and then also just focusing on exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have a question here from Richard. He says, were there other ethnic or national groups who were very concerned by the changes to personal and group status? Jews, for example, were Mennonites aware of these other groups? Did they seek allies?
No, they didn't seek allies. Mennonites are patron seekers, not ally seekers, or at least that's my interpretation of Mennonite history. It's a good point about there were changes. So changes to the status of Jews, and Jews obviously are a little bit more complicated because there are discriminatory policies that are built into the Russian Empire which are going to continue even though Jews are being conscripted. So the roles that they can perform are limited. Their access to mobility, kind of upward mobility within the military, is limited as well. But Mennonites didn't concern themselves with that. They also didn't concern themselves with the Lutheran and Catholic Germans who lost their own military exemption at the exact same time. And at one point, at least one German, I don't know if it was a Lutheran or Catholic, said something to the extent of, well, we should have done what the Mennonites did. We should have asked for some exemptions. And if you don't ask, then no one gives it to you. Now, obviously, in their cases, it would have been much more difficult. So this is another aspect of Mennonite history that doesn't get acknowledged as much as it should, is that exceptions are made for us because we fit a mold that people like. And in this case, it's being Christian. So the fact that these are Christians who have these ideas about not serving in the military, people are much more willing to listen to that than they are necessarily other groups, and are much more willing to make concessions for that.
Peter asks, the terms negotiated in the Privilegium exempt Mennonites from quartering military exempt for military units temporarily passing through their colonies, hence the readiness of Mennonites to do this during the Crimean War. Is that something that you want to talk about? Like, how can they give service during the Crimean War, but then kind of how do they negotiate that?
So they were very much willing to give service during the Crimean War, and even though later on some will regret it, troops kind of came in, troops stayed with people, Mennonite women, I presume, cooked for these troops, officers staying with them, and they treated the wounded. They also got sick from diseases coming through by being close to the military zone. So they clearly wanted to be involved and show their, I don't want to use the word patriotism. I don't know if patriotism quite defines it at this moment, but they were willing to do their part. And they show that again with the Russo-Turkish War, of this willingness to do their part and contribute through finances. And it's very interesting that the Russian state makes the point that Mennonites didn't ask for money. So in some other cases, there are some groups who have wagons or moving things for the military, and they are getting paid to do so. So it's actually an economic benefit to do that. But the Russian state emphasized that Mennonites actually paid for this on their own. And so that this made them a little bit more worthy in their eyes. And I don't think that they knew that this was going to become an issue later on, that either it was going to be used against them, but also for them, like in negotiations that are taking place.
Right. You never know what's going to happen in the future.
That's right. I had no idea.
Hildegard asks, In addition to the issue of non resistance, wasn't economics a large motivation for the 19th century migration? Specifically, landlessness and poor quality of land in Bergtal, for example. In your estimation, what were the greatest motivating factors for the 19th century migration?
Yeah, so this issue of economics has been debated with obviously Delbert Platt trying to push back against the idea of this being a migration that is based in landlessness, and to actually say that this is not the case and that this is something that is quite different. When everyone is migrating from, there's mass migrations taking place, it means that not everyone can be landless, right? And especially in these cases, the Berktalers are paying for each other to go. So there is money and finances that are there that are helping move people. Now, obviously, people are thinking about land and they're thinking about the future. They know that there is limited amount of land where they're living, and the getting access to that land, especially with the emancipation of the serfs and all sorts of other things, is going to be a little bit tricky to negotiate. And they now can go to this place where it is seemingly, of course, now we know that it's not empty spaces, but they perceive it in that way, and that they think that there are going to be more opportunities there. So definitely they are thinking that this is has some economic benefit. Now, Mennonites at that time are debating what are the reasons. So they are saying, oh, well, it's people who don't want to speak Russian. It's people who are, just want to take from the land and then leave, who don't really have any attachment to the land. And there's all sorts of judgments that are being piled on at this moment. But for sure that in the kind of negotiations that are taking place, there is a strong sense that we don't want to be a part of whatever is being built, and that we might as well just leave now because, and you have to remember this, there's a window. Now, of course, people can leave later on, right? Like this isn't the Soviet Union, there isn't a shut door policy, and there'll be plenty of migration later on. But this is a time in which the Russian state has said, we will give you your passport. You can leave. And so it seems like, okay, well, if this is what's going to take place, then maybe now is a good time to do it, if we're going to do it at all.
Mm-hmm. John Jansen asks, did the Mennonites propose any monetary remuneration to the Russian government as their ancestors did in Prussia?
Yes, they did. And this was not taken seriously by the Russian state. Now, obviously, they will undertake some financial responsibility for the forestry service, and there will be taxes based for that within the community. So there will be something. But yes, they do. They kind of say, we'll pay for exemption, and that is not fitting with the vision that the Russian state is putting forward. And it's not only just the Russian state, and sometimes people get confused. They think this is an autocratic state. Yes, it is. It's an autocratic state with a bureaucracy. So there are people with different opinions within that bureaucracy, and there is a media. And this media was not very appreciative of Mennonites and any sort of exemptions being given to them. And there were some articles that appeared in Russian language newspapers that kind of said, you know what, you don't want to be here, then we don't want you to be here. You don't want to contribute to the state through this duty, then we don't want you to, then maybe you should just go. So it wasn't just the Russian state sort of determining on its own. There's also the local population. And that comes up in the documents as well, is that Tatlebin says to the Mennonites, look, if we didn't have you do anything, your neighbors are going to resent you so much. So there has to be something, you can't just get away with this, pay for something. You need to actually make some sort of sacrifice in order to make this palpable for other people. So that definitely comes up in the documents.
You mentioned the documents. I'm wondering if you can give us a bit more of a sense of these documents. So you said they were at Mennonite Heritage Archives, and that they haven't been generally used by Mennonite scholars. Do you have any thoughts about why not, or why do Mennonite scholars tend to focus on more sources produced by Mennonites? Can you just give us a sense of what these documents are?
Yeah, so these are documents. We've done some amazing things throughout our history of building our own archives, is that there have been numerous microfilm and digitization projects taking place in Ukrainian and Russian archives. over the years. And these were done by Paul Taves, these were done by Harvey Dick. A number of people contributed to this, and it produced fantastic resources that are coming from the documents I'm talking about tonight are all from the Russian Imperial Archives in St. Petersburg. So they're wonderful documents. Now, of course, Mennonites tend to focus, and this has always been one of our issues, is tends to focus on Mennonite-produced documents because Mennonite-produced documents are in German, and this is all in handwritten Russian. So that becomes the issue. And so this is something that people have been talking about for decades now, of like how we need to introduce Russian language sources into scholarship. And of course, that does happen. But sometimes it's good to revisit these cases that we've really dived into through Mennonite sources and to now reconsider them using Russian sources.
Mm-hmm. And so these are reproduced documents from the archives in Russia, but located here at Mennonite Heritage in Winnipeg.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. I'm just keeping an eye on okay, Richard Ratzlaff has another question here. You noted that the Russian Empire offered the Mennonites passports, but that the decision to leave meant the renunciation of citizenship. What did citizenship mean at the time? What rights came with citizenship?
Well, this is when we're negotiating Russian citizenship, right? This is part of the reforms that are taking place in that Russia is trying to introduce this concept of citizenship into its population. And that is one of the reasons why it gets rid of this colonist status and is trying to bring the Germans in. It actually thinks it's doing a favor for these populations, is saying, look, for all this time, we've kept you separate. And now we want to bring you in. We want you to have the same rights. We want you to be in our community. And so, and being in our community is going to be part of being a citizen and then also serving in the military. So they are kind of beginning to conceptualize what this means within the Russian Empire. Obviously, it's still a very developing concept, but they are using words of citizenship, but then you must renounce it when you when you leave.
Mm-hmm. So we're probably going to wrap up in a few minutes here, but we'll keep an eye out. Maybe there's someone typing out there who just hasn't hit enter yet. Aileen, you mentioned, I think you said something like the 1870s migration is super interesting. What makes you want to deal with that migration in particular? Like what personally draws you to that area of research?
Well, part of my family came in the 1870s, so I was part of this, my ancestry was part of this migration. But more than that, it's, I think mass migrations, Mennonites are a really great example of mass migrations and how they unfold. And I'm particularly interested in sort of the ways in which people move. So how they get themselves organized, how they get their passports, the travel routes that they take, all the possibilities that are being created at that moment, but then also what happens afterwards. So when you have a third of your population leave, that has significant implications for the community that remains. And the same thing happens in the 1920s. You have this large group of people leave, and then you have the ones that remain. And in that case, the 1920s. So in the 1870s, we have some specific religious groups that are leaving. We can say that a lot of some of the more conservative-minded people are leaving. That doesn't mean that they're economically weak in any way. So let's make sure that we have that point. And it also doesn't mean in Kleine Gemeinde communities, they're teaching Russian in their school system. So they, when we use conservative, it's a little bit more complicated than sometimes how we think about it. But you have these people leave, and then you have this remaining group and how they deal with it. And then in the 1920s, you have a lot of ministers, teachers leave. And so how does that then reshape society? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I like to study the 1870s, but also the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. And I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I have a last one. So you talk about this is a topic on migration, right? And we've talked more specifically about the 1870s one. And we've talked about how these mythologies, one of the dangers or pitfalls of them is that they pit one migration against another. And, we left for the best reasons, or, you were worse because you stayed and compromised or acquiesced. as we're coming up to all of these anniversaries, how would you see us going forward if these are mythologies that have these pitfalls of dividing Mennonites in Canada into these different groups and categories? How would you? Is there a better way forward, or what are your thoughts as we approach all of these anniversaries?
Well, I think that showing interest in migrations that are not your own would be a first step forward, and then also understanding, the multiplic that this isn't a competition, that this is actually just people's experiences, and that we can have a richer understanding of our history if we understand all of these different experiences, and if we are open to also, and I put this maybe gently, in reconsidering how we understand our own personal histories. So, in a lot of cases, people have these ideas about what happened to their ancestors that are not necessarily accurate, and they have built part of their identity on the basis of those ideas, and so they're hard to let go of. But one thing wonderful about our community is that we are very historically minded, right? That we have invested a lot of energy into understanding our history. We have great resources like the museum, we have the archives, the two archives in Winnipeg. We have all sorts of resources there because we are interested in our history. So just making sure that we are open to educating ourselves about what happened.
Hmm. Thanks for that. That is something that we deal with as a museum. We're anticipating exhibits on these topics, and so you think, well, how do you mark, what are important dates, but how do you mark them in a way that's relevant and good for the community going forward? So we could chat about that for a long time. But we won't keep you that long. So we'll. Oh, not a question. Lori Reimer Weeb says, not a question, but thank you for your opening comments, acknowledging the land on which we are sitting, thinking about the original inhabitants of the lands to which our ancestors migrated to. So it's a comment from Lori. But just as we're wrapping up, thanks so much, Aileen, for taking everyone's questions. On behalf of Mennonite Heritage Village and all the viewers on tonight's webinar, I want to really thank you for your presentation and shining a new light kind of on something that we think, oh, 1870s, we know this, but clearly we don't.